Hey y'all, Melissa here with you today, and today we are going to talk about shoulder fitting. The shoulders of your tops affect everything below them because this is like the hangers of your body and everything is hanging from the shoulder. If you don't have your shoulders properly fitted, it's going to affect everything else on your garment. Let's start by taking a look at properly fitted shoulders. So I made this little bodice for my dress form to show you what shoulders should look like. Notice I don't have any sagging in the neckline here. The shoulder seam is sitting correctly on the shoulder. The fabric does come a little bit past the shoulder, but that is because we are going to eventually sew sleeves on this, so you do need a seam allowance to sew on the sleeve. But you can see that the seam runs right down the center of that shoulder there, and that is what a properly fitted shoulder should look like. So what we're going to cover today is some issues with incorrect shoulder slope, incorrect shoulder width, and incorrect shoulder seam placement. Let's take a look at what you see if you need a sloped shoulder adjustment. So a sloped shoulder adjustment is when your shoulder is sloped more than the pattern is sloped from the neckline to the shoulder point. And just for reference, your shoulder point, if you lift up your arm to the side and you see that little kind of divot there, your shoulder point is that bone right in front of that. So that is where you generally want the seam of the shoulder to be hitting you. If you need a sloped shoulder adjustment because your shoulders are more sloped, one of the things you're going to see is excess fabric kind of in the arm side area here. Now this can be tricky because a lot of times this can get mixed up with needing a full bust adjustment. So here's how you tell that it's a sloped shoulder and not a full bust. If you pinch the excess fabric out of the shoulder and that wrinkling basically goes away and you don't continue to have like these folds around the bust here, then that is a good indication that the issue is in the shoulder and not in the bust. If you pinch it out and you still have wrinkles there because your shirt just keeps riding higher, that's probably a full bust adjustment needed. So let's look at how to fix this if you need a sloped shoulder adjustment. I've got a very basic bodice pattern here, and I've got the seam allowances marked out. You do want to go ahead and mark those because we're going to do our alteration in the seam allowance so that we don't change the shape of the arm side, and because of that, then we won't need to change the sleeve at all. So I'm going to cut right along the seam allowance here of my shoulder and down the arm side and side seam. And then all I need to do is I'm going to measure like how much I pinched out here, which looks like at the end I pinched out about 1/2 inch. So if I was making that alteration, what I would want to do is lower that outer point of the shoulder 1/2 inch, and that is going to make my shoulder slope steeper than it was originally drafted to be. So I'm just going to lower that. I would trace the shoulder, and then you can go back and retrace the rest of the arm side, trued out because you cut in the seam allowance. And that would be how you would adjust the shoulder slope without changing the length of the shoulder and without changing the length of the arm side. Because if you change either of those things, then you have to go and alter the sleeve as well. You want to do this on the front and the back because if you notice here, I'm pinching out an equal amount on the front and back shoulder, and it is out here at the point, not up here by the neck. That's another clue that this is a shoulder slope adjustment that is needed. Now, what about if your shoulder is straighter than the pattern is drafted for? What you might see if that is the case, if you have straight shoulders and the pattern is more sloped, is you might find excess fabric in the neck area. And that's because the slope is hitting you at the point of the shoulder, but then since it's more sloped, you have extra fabric like in the neck area. This might also feel tight in the armpits because it's pulling up to your straighter shoulder, and then the extra slope and extra fabric is in the neckline. And the neckline may show only the excess in the front, or it may also have excess in the back neckline. And the way you fix this is basically the opposite of how you do a sloped shoulder adjustment. For a straight shoulder adjustment, you're going to pinch out that amount there, and you're going to check on how much that is. So if we measure this, it looks like I've got about an extra ½ inch there. And then just like we did for the sloped shoulder adjustment, cut your pattern on the seam line, and this time you want to raise it by the amount to straighten out that shoulder seam, and then you can trace that and kind of pull in your arm side, true that up, and trace that so that you haven't changed the length of the arm side at all. All right, let's talk about a forward shoulder adjustment, which is an incredibly commonly needed adjustment. My theory is we spend so much time like hunched forward looking at screens and phones that everybody's shoulders have kind of moved forward. And a forward shoulder adjustment is needed when the seam isn't hitting you on the center of your shoulder. So what you'll see is it'll feel like the shoulder seam is sitting further back onto your shoulder, and it may feel like the neckline is kind of pinching you or pulling back, or like you're constantly wanting to adjust your shirt forward. That's all clues that you might need a forward shoulder adjustment. So as you can see here, here is where the center of the shoulder is, but this seam is back here. And this is a super easy adjustment to make. So let's pretend this is a back here instead of a front. Literally all you have to do is measure the amount between where the seam is hitting and where you need it to hit. And then you're going to cut that amount off of the front of the shoulder, and you add it to the back of the shoulder. And that's it. You just are bringing that seam forward so that we've got more from the back coming forward onto the front. Now, depending on the amount of forward shoulder adjustment you have to do, you may also want to adjust your sleeve. Okay, here is a sleeve, and I can tell that this is the front and this is the back of the sleeve because there's usually a more pronounced curve on the sleeve front, and that's because the ball of your shoulder is towards the front, even if you don't need a forward shoulder adjustment. But if I'm having to adjust my seam a whole lot, what I would want to do to adjust my sleeve is draw a line on the sleeve, and then I want to draw one perpendicular to that. Generally, the grain line would be a good guide for this line. And then I need to shift forward. So I'm going to cut my sleeve, and then this line will show me the amount that I need to shift forward. So if I shifted my seam on my shoulder ½ an inch forward, I would want to take this perpendicular line, shift it forward, and then I kind of redraw my curves here so that the ball of the shoulder that's pointing forward is now accommodated on the forward part of the shoulder. So that's how you would adjust the sleeve if you had to do a big forward shoulder adjustment. A lot of times if your forward shoulder adjustment is ½ inch or less, you don't actually need to adjust the sleeve. You'll just still put it in the hole because you're not changing the overall length of the arm side. You're just changing where that shoulder seam is. So the sleeve arm size should still match your pattern arm side. Let's talk about a narrow shoulder adjustment. So the clue that you would need this would be if the pattern has a style that's supposed to hit at the shoulder point, not a drop shoulder, because there are drop shoulder styles that intentionally have the seam going past the shoulder point. But if it is not a drop shoulder style and you have like excess past the point of your shoulder, more excess than just a seam allowance, like this is not just a seam allowance here, this is a lot of excess, then you might need a narrow shoulder adjustment. This is another one that can commonly be confused with needing a full bust adjustment. A lot of times if you are constantly finding that the shoulders are too wide, you may be choosing the wrong size to begin with. You may actually need to choose a smaller size and then do a full bust adjustment to accommodate your bust. But if the bust fits correctly and the only thing is the shoulders and they are too wide, here's how you do a narrow shoulder adjustment. So what we're going to do here is we are going to take a wedge kind of here out of the shoulder. So I'm drawing that line there, and then perpendicular, like in the center of that line, I want to draw another one. And we're going to make this like a hinge. So I'm cutting it down to here. And then what I want to do is measure the amount, and remember seam allowances, but measure the amount that I want to take out here. So let's say I needed to take out like 1/2 inch. I might move the shoulder seam in 1/2 inch. So now it is narrower. Then I'm going to cut it and hinge it this way as well so that I can fix the shoulder slope. So move it in here, and then I'm going to move this piece so that I can fix the shoulder slope. I may need to tape all of this in and then still cut on the seam line here to accommodate the correct shoulder slope. But just do one adjustment at a time. Narrow the shoulder first, make another muslin, try it on, and then if you need to do any more slope adjustments, you can do that. Let's talk about what a broad shoulder adjustment might look like. So if you find you need a broad shoulder adjustment, what you're going to see is fabric that doesn't quite reach the shoulder point, or maybe it barely reaches the shoulder point, but not enough to have a seam allowance. You'll also typically see this in the back as well, not just in the front, where the back will not be wide enough to hit the point of the shoulder. So in this case, you would need a broad shoulder adjustment. Now, let's make sure first that this is a broad shoulder adjustment and not an issue where you actually need width across the whole back. And the difference would be in very muscular backs. For example, swimmers find this a lot. They actually need room across the entire back of the garment instead of just the shoulder. So it depends on, is it just that the shoulder isn't reaching the shoulder point, or is it also kind of tight across the whole back? If it's tight across the whole back, then you probably need a broad back adjustment. If it's just in the shoulders that you need this, then you're going to slash it in a wedge like we did for the narrow shoulder adjustment. And you would pull the wedge out, and then you would take that top wedge and pull it down so that you still have the correct shoulder slope, but you have added width to just the shoulder area. If you found this useful, check out this playlist. I've got more tips and tricks for sewing your own clothing that I hope you find helpful.